Well, I'm really happy to be back with you all. After my talk in February, I feel it must be sure that Emily didn't ask anybody whether or not they wanted me to come back, because at the time I was talking about this idea that I had recently written about WTF politics and sort of how things seem to be always stood on their head. I think the real title of my talk in February was However Bad You Think It Is, It's Much Worse. And the subtitle is, and whatever you're doing, it's not enough. So it was a very uplifting talk. This time it is going to be, I think, a bit more positive and a bit more focused on what we can do, although in the context of some daunting challenges. So the title this time is kind of this idea of connecting the dots of what we do in our lives, privately and as small groups, congregations, communities, and how can we, and if so, how can we magnify those efforts where they become transformative rather than sort of isolated points of light, to quote one of the earlier George Bushes. So my preoccupation these days, we still have our farm, and my bread and butter for making a living is Scale Incorporated, and Scale basically takes the lessons that I learned from working here for the last chunk of time and other things I've picked up to communities around the country. So I'll work in Arkansas and South Carolina, North Carolina. I've done work with folks in the middle of Harlem and the South Bronx, over in Kansas and Arizona, quite a few clients. And it's great work because on the one hand, I get virtually always to be working with small, relatively diverse groups of people who are fundamentally just trying to make their places better. A lot of the time around food and farming issues, food systems, food justice, food access, sometimes around kind of a broader new vision of economics and a new economic paradigm that they're beginning to think about. So that's my bread and butter. But what that work combined with working in this region for most of 30 years has also taught me that, and I certainly said this the last time, that whatever is happening locally, and there is an amazing array of things happening locally. The book that I wrote that's coming out in May highlights about 40 different examples of communities all around the country doing really amazing things. I mean, just startling things. But even in spite of that, in spite of the fact that there's more communities doing more interesting work, at the larger level of who writes the rules of the game, who makes the rules, we've mostly, not totally, but mostly been either stagnant or losing ground. So I've become, over the last few years, starting with my little dabble in politics in 2012, but continuing since then, to try to figure out how to change that. How do we not only lift up these amazing things around food and farming, alternative energy, green development zones in the middle of poor communities, all kinds of things. How do we lift them up? But again, how do we give them a political force? How do we make them something that changes the public consensus, that builds power, and ultimately leads to better rules of the game? So that's kind of my preoccupation. And Derek Von Kundra is here, and one of the things, if you haven't already seen it, is Derek is my delightful partner in this YouTube thing that we launched about not quite 3 months ago. So we're doing a weekly YouTube series, the point of which is to try to get a broader group of folks engaged around these issues, mostly economics, a fair bit on food and farming, but most recently I did one that connected sort of farmer-rural concerns with what's happening with police brutality and police violence. So it's kind of far-reaching, and Derek has been just absolutely terrific to work with. But if you haven't, check that out. It's called Take 5 with Tony, his clever little name. And they're very short, 5 minutes or less, and they're a way to try to grapple with this. So we're doing a lot of different things. So what I want to talk about today is this connection between our local, relatively private, or at least parochial, in the literal sense, parochial worlds with this bigger picture. And I want to start with, as I want to do, some bad example, some bad news about what happens when we don't make those connections, when we maybe work hard in our own places, but we don't deliberately and systematically and just relentlessly try to magnify the impact of that. So, one example would be that for the last 20 years or so, I'd say, and certainly accelerating the last 10 years, has been what has happened to local political engagement in Southwest Virginia, generally. Washington County, we'll say specifically at this point. And it's been generally a sort of decline where, on the one hand, a more conservative brand of republicanism has risen to the top, which is relatively new to our region. If some of you have been around long enough to remember William Wampler Jr. and some of those folks, there was actually a kind of not just a moderate tone to what they believed, but a pragmatic tone. And so there was a lot of cross-party working. Well, that has really, we've lost that, and it's not entirely, but considerably more ideological. But at the same time, the other side, the Democrats, have become punier and more pathetic with each passing year, basically. And so that's kind of a local reality. The consequences of that means that we have become a region that has contributed to some pretty, not only our own local issues, but some pretty shocking things at the national level. Let's start with the election of George W. Bush. You know, we can talk about Florida, and if you read Ari Berman's new book, Give Us the Ballot, which is about much more than that, but he talks specifically about just how fraudulent the 2000 election results were. But on the other hand, besides what happened in Florida, there was plenty of people, young and middle-aged, fewer old people, who sat on their hands and sat that one out, didn't get motivated. And as a result, we elected George W. And whatever you think of him, it's clear that that gave us some incredibly long-lasting worldwide consequences. What the Iraq War and our Mideast, sort of transforming the Mideast policy, has done lingers with us today, so much so that it affects all of our lives on a daily basis because it's the justification for this incredibly intrusive national security state we have. It's the justification for the latest defense bill, which is still well over $600 billion a year. It's at least in part responsible for catastrophic suffering in the Middle East that's already happened, hundreds of thousands of people's lives lost, but this continued unraveling. Now, there's lots of other reasons, and I'm not somebody who doesn't give the Islamic State and Islamist fundamentalists plenty of credit. They get their own credit, and we're working on that before George W. came to power. But the fact is that what we did and what ordinary people in small local communities enabled to happen was a Mideast policy that was so disastrous that it's impacting our lives in countless ways. We are basically on the defensive for fear of many, many people who hate us. And our response to that is drone strikes and continued violence. And we don't really know what else to do. So that's one example of the real consequences of the sort of depolitization that has been ongoing with us. Another is around food policy, a little closer to home. So there's a lot of great stuff happening around foods, and food is kind of the leading edge of economic renewal, economic diversification, local economy efforts all over the country. And plenty of great stuff has happened. We know plenty of great stuff has happened here around that. But and there have even been some policy improvements. You know, there's been things in both the Farm Bill and in the Virginia legislature that have been moderately supportive of small to mid-sized farmers, of organic and sustainable farming, the research and the practice of that, of better food in public schools, the fruit and vegetable snack program. So there's been advances. Nevertheless, the dominant thread of our federal policy around food continues to be outsized support for a small group of commodity farmers and crops: corn, soybeans, cotton, rice, sugar. And not only support for sort of big farmers over small, and the numbers are startling, the differences, but for so-called conventional agriculture, and specifically agriculture that increasingly is dependent upon genetic engineering and GMOs as the core of those commodity crops versus the organic. So while there's been, like, you could almost think of it as crumbs off the table. And those of us who've gotten some of those crumbs, helping to build a local market or create a food hub in a community or invest in local farmer training or do outreach for organic production, we've been thrilled to get something. But the fact is there hasn't been a fundamental change. And so these local immersions of healthier, better food systems are still dwarfed by and repressed, really, or held back by a national policy that's pretty much the other end of the spectrum. And then third, I guess I would say, is around economics generally. So Friday's paper was like a double slap in the face for me, and maybe for some of you too. On the front page, there was an article, an entirely celebratory article about the grand opening of Cabela's at Exit 5, something that I fought back when it was being debated. That was the Cabela's that has been facilitated by $53 million in taxpayer subsidies. Lowe's will get around $10 or $12 million to move from Exit 7 to Exit 5, a 2-mile shift of habitat. And then a little bit further in the paper, Lori had put it out so she'd make sure I would see it, because I think I had a moment when I wasn't depressed, and she thought she would bring this out, was what we've all known for a while, the official word that the Exit 19 development, the Walmart development, is getting underway, with one of our county board of supervisors saying he thought it was among the best investments the county had ever made, while saying they weren't investing in Walmart, which is just a semantic thing. They're giving money to the developer, but they're only giving money to the developer in order to facilitate the building of the Walmart. So that way of thinking, which you could call corporate capitalism or crony capitalism, you could call it globalization, you can call it trickle-down economics, but that way of thinking that we invest in a tiny, tiny group of either very wealthy people or very large businesses continues to be the utter dominant way we go about trying to create prosperity, even as earlier that week, we had a local food summit where we talked about the opposite. And a few days before that, there was the Creative Economy Conference. And we had a woman from Massachusetts talking about building local currencies. And so even as in Southwest Virginia and East Tennessee, Western North Carolina, in New Mexico, and in all kinds of places, there is this bubbling up of economic alternatives that are demonstrably better, not only anecdotally, but the research says they're so much better economically in terms of building stable economies, in terms of job creation, in terms of social outcomes, in terms of the health of the community, even though we know that those economies are much better for us in almost every way. We continue primarily to give money to the Walmarts, to the Cabela's, and for that matter, Amazon. Amazon got over $430 million over the last 2 years in public subsidies, $430 million. Amazon, which pretty much takes the wind out of many local businesses because of the convenience and ease that they provide. So again, something is wrong when all over the country, these better alternatives in food, in economics, in civic engagement are emerging, but very little changes in our paradigm, in our way of thinking, and in the policies that support it. So what I kind of suggested last time, and what I'm going to suggest with some examples this time, is that we really don't, if we want a better world, and I think probably everybody in this room does, we don't have any alternative except to figure out a new strategy that builds on, that takes full advantage of, that highlights this emergence of better economic and community alternatives, but goes far beyond that to engage the public in a debate that creates real political will and political power that eventually leads to better rules, to better policy. So I'm going to give 3 good examples now of where I think that an example of some of those dot connecting things are happening. First, I'm going to read a quote from Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow. I know Maura's read it. Has anybody else read this book? It's now almost 5 years old, and it just took me a while to get to it. It's certainly startling and sobering, but it's also an incredibly important book because she shows that the problem we have is about more than just 2.2 million people in prison, that more than almost triple that number are out of prison or in the prison pipeline and largely disenfranchised as citizens, largely having the same status that they had in Jim Crow. But talking about that and talking about the question of whether to take a sort of a piecemeal approach or whether we need some broader, more transformative change, she says, those who believe that advocacy challenging mass incarceration can be successful without overturning the public consensus that gave rise to it are engaging in fanciful thinking, the public consensus that gave rise to the phenomenon of mass incarceration. A form of denial. Isolated victories can be won, even a string of victories, but in the absence of a fundamental shift in public consciousness, the system as a whole will remain intact. And just a little bit later, she goes on to give an example of how that happened, and she talks about the Brown versus Board of Education decision of 1954 that desegregated public schools. The statistics from the southern states are truly amazing. For 10 years, 1954 to 1964, virtually nothing happened. Not a single black child attended an integrated public grade school in South Carolina, Alabama, or Mississippi as of the 1963 school year. Across the South as a whole, a mere 1% of black school children were attending school with whites in 1964, a full decade after Brown was decided. Brown, the Supreme Court decision, did not end Jim Crow. A mass movement had to emerge first, one that aimed to create a new public consensus opposed to the evils of Jim Crow. And of course, she's calling for that now in terms of the prison industrial complex and mass incarceration. So that's kind of the context. I think ultimately it is around building a new public consensus. You know, it's interesting, and sometimes even the building of a new public consensus does not lead to, in any immediate sense, to better public policy. I just read a New York Times poll that 56% of self-identified conservative Republicans now believe that climate change is happening and that humans are playing a role in it, and 72% of those same folks support accelerated investment and development of renewable energy sources. So we're getting somewhere in some ways with the public consensus. There's still a lag in terms of that translating to our so-called representatives. But some things are happening in our area, and I'm excited about. So I'll give you three, and then I'll stop, and we'll hopefully chat a bit. One is around GMOs, genetically modified organisms. And again, our little YouTube series has a 4-part series on GMO that features all kinds of cool things in it. And here's what I want to say about that. So that's an issue that's been around for a good long time. The sustainable ag advocacy community, the folks concerned about food safety, have been fighting that battle for a long time. And over the last few years, 3 states have passed mandatory state labeling laws. Vermont, Connecticut, and I can't remember the third, sorry. But 3 states have, after long fights. In July, the House of Representatives passed HB 1599, which some folks call the Dark Act, which does this. It makes any mandatory labeling of genetically modified foods at the federal level or the state level or the local level illegal, and would overturn the 3 existing state laws. That's the first thing it does. The second thing is it prohibits any form of regulation, whether through zoning or anything else, at state, municipal, or county levels that would in any way regulate the production of genetically modified crops. So in other words, if you were in a hotbed of like organic producers who are concerned about drift of pollen, you couldn't pass a law that would in any way protect them. And in fact, there's folks in Oregon who've done just such that, and their law to create buffer zones would be overturned by this. So it's a really potent kind of comprehensive law to make sure that the GMOs, which already dominate the commodity market, have free rein to get into the rest of the market. Locally, I gave a talk a little over a month ago at Lemon Sue's health food store that was, let's say it was a full house because it was a very small room, but there was a group of people there, and 2 of the people there that you might know, Tom Boyle and Marcia Murray, is that the last name? Yeah. Wonderful, wonderful folks. The next day after the talk, they contacted me and said, we're really upset about this. We want to do something. Can we do petition? Can we do a letter writing campaign? Well, anyway, the long and short of Marcia and Tom's instigation there was the three of us and Tom Peterson and some others meeting with Senate staff from both Kane and Warner, who were both Democrat but both very much on the fence on this issue, producing a letter that was then put out at Elder Spirit, at Lum and Sue's, at the Glade Green Grocer, at the Farmers Market, that ultimately we got just from our little local community 175 signed letters, many with their own comments, that we presented to Senator Kane's and Senator Warner's staff. And then subsequent to that, a little activation of a similar strategy in places like Floyd and Salem and Roanoke and the eastern part of Virginia around Williamsburg. So our little effort, which started with kind of a little nugget of education at that seminar, became an advocacy effort which not only was locally strong, but engaged the senior policy staff from both Kane and Warner, who we connected with directly. It produced a lot of good documentation, real valid documentation as to what these issues were, and then became part of a statewide thing. And even percolated up a bit where we're working with several national organizations, the Organic Consumers Association, Food and Water Watch, and others that are using some of those materials and helping. So we haven't won that fight. It's an uphill battle. I'm not sure what the odds are, but it's an example where the success of the local food system was really the foundation for that. People like Marcia and Tom and others who have experienced a better local food system, I think were inclined to get involved because they see there really is an alternative. That then became a pretty focused effort. That's one example. Another is maybe a bit more fledgling, but it's around the issue of mass incarceration, police violence, Black Lives Matter. I haven't been directly involved in that, but many of you know that for a good 20 years, maybe 25 years on now, APEC's been doing its annual Martin Luther King gathering, which is mostly celebratory and one of the few really interracial gatherings that happens in Washington County. And over the last 2 or 3 years, Bucky Boone and others involved with that have been really trying to broaden that to being more than a one-day celebration of King's life, but to really start grappling with some of the issues to varying degrees of success. And then between that and the beginning of the Black Lives Matter movement and the constant news reports of yet another shooting of an unarmed black kid or brown kid, came a number of marches back this past spring, led mostly by students and young people. Exactly where that's going is not 100% clear to me, but I know there's energy around the issue, and there are things happening nationally now that, although they're pretty tepid, they're good. A number of you might have heard that there's a bipartisan bill now in the Senate that would, it's a criminal justice reform bill that would start grappling with the mandatory minimum sentences. It would start dealing with judicial discretion, with drug crime, the disproportionate penalties, only in a pretty minimal way. Like your second offense, your mandatory minimum sentence will no longer be 20 years, it'll be 15 years for a second. I mean, it's still just mind-bogglingly punitive and unproductive, but some movement there that's a bipartisan effort. And I just read yesterday that a Supreme Court judge in the state of New York, after the state legislature just wouldn't do anything about their bail issue, which most states have, he's taken it on and now is changing the bail conditions because there are, as Michelle Alexander points out, thousands upon thousands of people who end up in jail for weeks, for months, for years, simply because they can't pay. Never been tried, certainly never been convicted, most of these people. They're stuck in jail because they can't pay. Disproportionately black and brown, but poor people generally. And that is so un-American and so unjust. Again, we're only just beginning to, but I can see the possibility of the local kind of race relations, Martin Luther King, Black Lives Matter effort here becoming somehow linked to some of those national efforts and giving it momentum. Because that has to be a movement that includes white people in rural communities too. It can't just be black activists and progressive activists in big cities. It's got to include ordinary working white folks in rural communities because we are the communities that elect the people that retard any progress on that for the most part, right? So we've got to engage. Lastly, so that general decline of the Democratic Party, the sort of rise of a different kind of Republican Party and the what you might call lethargy of any sort of political perspective on the left or of progressives. Reese Shearer, who many of you know, I guess along with Karen Quesenberry, Karen Schaefer, Ernie Braganza, Lori and I, and a few other folks, but Reese as the driving force, and Reese is a driving force, created this organization called WIN, Washington County Independent Neighbors, and that arose out of just a lot of defeats on fracking, on the Exit 24 truck stop, on education budgets, just sort of getting whooped and whooped and whooped. And finally, this group, somewhat coming out of the intergenerational progressive group, started talking about what can we do. Well, it's pretty remarkable what's happened. You've probably read a little bit about it. And basically in the span of about 6 months is how much time we spent to organize it. In the span of about 3 months, went from an idea to a group with over 300 members now, all in the county. There were 8 people running for Board of Supervisors. It's focused strictly on the Board of Supervisors at this point in 3 different districts, 8 people running, and 4 districts, 8 people running. And every one of them sought the WIN endorsement, even though the group had never even existed a few months earlier. So what that says to me is that mobilizing people locally is still possible. Re-engaging people in a decidedly political, even electoral political context is possible. I think Reese and the efforts there of lots of people have demonstrated that. So it's pretty exciting. We don't know the long-term impact of it, but I could imagine certainly WIN becoming a real potent political force. It's neither Democrat nor Republican. Both Democrats and Republicans have received the endorsement, but it is clearly stated values that most of us would categorize as progressive values. Now, what if WIN-type groups began to emerge in many, many places that are basically politically depressed, maybe economically as well, but politically depressed, where people have essentially given up on electoral politics for good reason? What if that started happening? You can then imagine the possibility of, by both joining forces, but more so simply by re-energizing people to the possibilities that we really can impact the people who govern us, that as we gain a foothold with that, it's certainly not a done deal, but it's possible to imagine that the very people participating in WIN and WIN-like groups all over the state and all over the country could then start taking on state government and state legislatures and then the federal government. It's a strategy that Gar Alperovitz, who's with the Democracy Collaborative, calls a checkerboard approach to economic change, and he also mentions it in the sense of political change, where we try to find the most systematically important, strategically important allies and sort of things we can win on, and we keep building a base. Instead of always running into the pieces that we know we're going to get taken, we start working where we think we can have victories, and as over time, the checkerboard starts to look a little bit better for us. There's more of ours than of the other side, and I think something like WIN offers that potential as well. There's a group called the Working Families Party that is, in some sense, trying to do that in other places. They've been around, I think, about 8 or 10 years now. They're really strong in Oregon and New York. But some of those kind of local things are working. So for me, what it comes down to is this idea that all the good local work that many of us in this room have been involved with for years is good, and it is important, and it does provide the foundation to argue for something different. It's not just wishful thinking that we're talking about. We're not just standing on the sidelines and criticizing trickle-down economics or policing. We're presenting alternatives based in real-world experience and a fair number of successes. Now's the time to particularly when you think of Bernie Sanders' run so far, you realize that there is potential for significant change. I think now's the time for us to start figuring out how to do that systematically and relentlessly. So maybe some conversation, some questions?